The Middle Ages are usually associated with knights in shining armor, grand tournaments, and majestic castles. However, if you had been born in that era, there was about a 90% chance you would have been a peasant. In many ways, the history of peasantry reflects the saying, "Things were better in the past." Back in antiquity and the early Middle Ages, most European tribes had little to no rigid social hierarchy. Farming was just as common as defending your land with weapons or going on military campaigns with your chief. But as a ruling feudal class emerged, peasants became more and more dependent on them. By the 12th century, free peasants had almost disappeared. They were forced to work their lord's land and often had to share part of their harvest. Though calling it their land was a stretch, it actually belonged to the feudal lord or the church. In theory, the feudal lord provided protection to the peasants in his domain. In reality, by the height of the Middle Ages, this was practically meaningless. The biggest threat to a European feudal lord was usually another feudal lord, whose main goal was to seize land and the peasants working on it. Peasants were the economic foundation that supported the ever-growing structure of European feudalism, until that foundation cracked in the 14th century. With the rise of craftsmanship in the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe saw the emergence of luxury, fine clothing, jewelry, and grand palace architecture. The nobility suddenly had many tempting ways to spend money. And where did this wealth come from? The labor of peasants. Attitudes toward them worsened, reaching the point of outright disdain. At the same time, in the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe, wiping out nearly half the population. On one side, there was a massive population decline, with many peasants losing most of their family ties, making them willing to take drastic measures. On the other, feudal lords' appetites only grew. Amid this chaos, sparks of rebellion ignited. Merchants, landless knights, and even members of the clergy, like the Franciscans who believed all people descended from Adam and Eve, began asking an inconvenient question. Where did the nobility come from, and why were they living off the backs of everyone else? Naturally, the church cracked down on those asking such uncomfortable questions. The fires of the Inquisition burned across Europe. Starting in the 14th century, the continent plunged into a wave of peasant uprisings. France's Jacquerie, the Bundschuh movement in Germany, the Hussites in Bohemia. Peasants took up arms, and there were plenty of cases where, despite lacking numbers, they crushed elite knights. But today, we're going to talk about what weapons a peasant could actually use. Most people associate peasants with something as terrifying as pitchforks, and in a way, they were terrifying. In the literal sense, they were often depicted in medieval art alongside demons and evil spirits. This likely comes from surviving images of Neptune and other pagan gods, who were often shown holding tridents. To a medieval person, that entire pantheon was considered unholy, and an old-fashioned trident looked a lot like an everyday pitchfork. Superstitious peasants never brought pitchforks into the house, nor were they washed. Rain was considered enough to clean them. That said, most pitchforks were made entirely of wood. Metal was far too expensive to waste on tools for handling manure and hay. But starting from the 14th century, we see the rise of war forks. These had steel prongs about half a meter long, mounted on a wooden shaft roughly 2 meters in length. The long shaft made it easier to reach mounted opponents, while the narrow prongs were likely good at piercing chainmail. Since the prongs flared outward, they could also be used to pin down a fallen enemy. Some believe that war forks were also used to hold siege ladders in place. The choice of this design was probably influenced by the fact that peasants had been handling similar tools since childhood and were quite skilled with them. Interestingly, the phrase, "to lift an enemy on the forks," likely originates from the French Revolution in the late 18th century, when the Bastille was stormed, eventually leading to the fall of the monarchy. Another peasant weapon surrounded by myth and legend is the scythe. This tool is often associated with death, though the Bible more frequently mentions the sickle. It's hard to say exactly when people first thought of mounting a blade perpendicular to a wooden shaft for mowing, but it likely happened long before the rise of civilization. In some regions, sickles remained in use for a long time, and in Russia, scythes only became widespread under Peter the Great. Most people know that peasants sometimes wielded scythes as weapons, but there's a key detail that often gets overlooked. When repurposed for combat, the blade and its mounting were often straightened out, essentially turning it into a kind of glaive. In fact, some believe that the glaive and guisarme actually evolved from the war scythe. It's also worth noting that medieval scythe blades were thicker than modern ones, making them capable of dealing nasty cutting and slashing wounds. The first recorded use of war scythes is attributed to the Swiss, and by the 15th century, they were a standard weapon for the Hussites. The biggest advantage of this weapon was how easy it was to make. Any village blacksmith could modify a scythe blade and forge a proper mounting for it. Of course, neither scythes nor forks were ideal for stopping a cavalry charge. Instead, they were effective against cavalry that had already been slowed down and caught in melee combat. That said, most peasant weapons couldn't penetrate the high-quality plate armor of the 15th and 16th centuries. But peasants didn't need to pierce armor. Knocking a knight to the ground was often enough because once he was down, the rest could finish the job. Now, the next weapon we'll talk about isn't steeped in superstition, but it was arguably the most destructive in the peasant arsenal: the war flail, also known as the threshing flail. This weapon evolved from a tool used to thresh grain. It consisted of a wooden shaft with a freely swinging, striking head, often reinforced with metal. The flexible connection allowed the head to build up momentum and made it much harder to block. After 5 crusades against the Hussites, which cost Europe a good chunk of its knightly class, even the nobility started respecting this weapon. By the early 16th century, it was even used in tournaments. The Hussites had a specific name for soldiers who wielded flails: flailmen. The two-handed war flail was a formidable offensive weapon. Thanks to its long shaft and flexible striking head, it could deliver devastating blows while keeping the wielder at a safe distance. A mere 100-gram weight could inflict serious injuries, while the striking head of a two-handed flail could weigh up to 1.5 kilograms. And when you consider that the Hussites often wielded them from atop war wagons, their strikes came from above, aimed directly at a knight's head, which wasn't good news whether he was wearing a helmet or not. In England, this weapon was nicknamed Holy Water Sprinkler, a bit of grim soldier humor referencing its effect on skulls. But the best part? Flails were cheap and easy to make. Simple, brutal, and effective. The only real downside was that they weren't ideal for use in tight formations. All in all, these examples show that while peasants lacked access to professional weapons, they didn't just use everyday tools in battle. Instead, they modified them into deadly weapons or used variations with similar designs. In the end, victory was often determined not by the weapon itself, but by morale, strategy, tactics, and many other factors.